welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going deep into conspiracies and government cover-ups. And it all started with your interest in a Joe Rogan Experience episode with Ian Carroll. Expert speaker, are you ready to go down the rabbit hole with me?
Absolutely. Let's see if we can sift through all the speculation and see if we can find some real insights in this conversation.
Perfect. Now, Carroll just throws out a ton of theories in this
Yep.
episode. Yeah. Everything from JFK to COVID-19. But he starts by talking about why these conspiracies hook us in the first place. Why are we so fascinated by them?
Well, he and Rogan seem to agree that it comes down to our natural curiosity. Humans just have this need to understand the world around them, and sometimes the official explanation just doesn't cut it. We crave a deeper truth, even if that means questioning everything we thought we knew.
It's like we're all amateur detectives at heart, right? Trying to piece together the puzzle. But Carroll also makes a good point. You can't just accept everything you hear at face value. You need that critical thinking, that healthy skepticism to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah.
What do you think, listener? What pulls you into these kinds of stories? Is it the thrill of the unknown, the desire to challenge the status quo, or something else entirely?
Let's take the JFK assassination, for example. It's been decades, and people are still debating what really happened that day in Dallas. Carroll brings up the famous back into the left head movement you see in the Zapruder film, which suggests the fatal shot came from the front, not from the book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald was supposedly perched.
Right. And then there's David Liston's book, Best Evidence, which Carroll mentions. Liston really dug into the Warren Commission report, the official investigation, and found some really questionable stuff, like JFK's brain went missing from the evidence, and there were these conflicting reports about the neck wound. On top of that, multiple witnesses connected to the case died under mysterious circumstances. It's all pretty suspicious, right? Makes you wonder if there was a deliberate attempt to cover something up. What do you think, listener? Does knowing these details change how you view the official story?
And then you have the single bullet theory. The Warren Commission claimed that one bullet caused all of JFK's wounds and even injured Governor Connolly, who was sitting in front of him. But for many, this theory just seems physically impossible, leading to speculation about multiple shooters and raising questions about Oswald's role, if any, in the assassination.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something equally intriguing and a bit more unsettling. Enculture Carroll spends some time explaining this CIA program that ran for decades, where they were experimenting with mind control techniques. They were using LSD and other drugs, often on unwitting subjects, trying to figure out how to manipulate people's behavior. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, doesn't it?
It's a dark chapter in the CIA's history, for sure. And Carroll makes this fascinating, if disturbing, connection to Charles Manson, the leader of the Manson family cult. He mentions Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, which suggests that a psychiatrist involved with MKUltra, Louis Jolyon West, may have actually trained Manson in manipulation techniques using LSD.
And it gets even wilder. O'Neill's book puts forward this theory that the CIA intentionally infiltrated and manipulated the hippie counterculture movement in the 60s. Imagine that intelligence agencies using mind control and manipulation to control the narrative and discredit anti-war sentiment. It really makes you question how much of what we know about history is actually true.
Speaking of shadowy figures and potential manipulation, let's move on to the Epstein case. Carroll doesn't hold back here. He straight up claims that Epstein wasn't just some lone wolf, but part of a larger organized crime network with ties to intelligence agencies. What's particularly interesting is his use of the term compartmentalization. He suggests that this is how these powerful people stay in the shadows. They can benefit from operations like Epstein's without having direct knowledge of the specifics, giving them plausible deniability. It's like a layer of protection for those at the top.
And to add fuel to the fire, Carroll throws out names like Leslie Wexner, the founder of Victoria's Secret, and the Mega Group, this secretive group of wealthy individuals. He suggests that Epstein was using his connections to cultivate relationships with the rich and powerful, possibly compromising them for blackmail. It paints this picture of an elite group operating above the law, using their wealth and influence to exploit and control others. It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It certainly raises questions about how power works and who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now Carroll connects the Epstein case to a larger pattern of CIA covert operations throughout history.
Yeah, he goes way back, tracing the agency's origins to 1947 and highlighting the role of Allen Dulles, their first director. From the get-go, the CIA was involved in all sorts of clandestine operations, often working to protect American corporate interests. One example he gives is the 1954 coup in Guatemala, where the CIA helped overthrow the democratically elected government to benefit the United Food Company, which had these huge banana plantations there. It's a classic example of how corporate power and government intelligence can intertwine to influence global events, often at the expense of democracy and the people those companies are exploiting.
It's important to remember that the CIA was formed in the wake of World War II, a time when the U.S. was facing the rise of communism. So a lot of their early operations were justified as necessary to combat this perceived threat. But as Carol points out, those lines can get blurred really quickly. When does protecting national security become protecting corporate interests?
Right.
And at what cost?
And he brings up another interesting example, Operation Underworld. During World War II, the U.S. government actually partnered with the mob to secure ports and prevent sabotage by German spies. They cut deals with guys like Lucky Luciano, essentially outsourcing national security to organized crime. It shows how far the government is willing to go, even compromising its own principles to achieve its goals. What do you think, listeners? Does this surprise you, or does it fit into your understanding of how power operates in the world?
And this brings us to a particularly dark chapter, the CIA's alleged involvement in drug trafficking. Carol starts with the opium trade in Afghanistan during the U.S. occupation after 9/11. It's a pretty stark contrast, right? The U.S. military is supposed to be fighting the war on drugs, yet they're also guarding poppy fields, the source of heroin. It raises questions about who benefits from this trade and whether the war on drugs was ever truly winnable.
He then goes on to talk about George H.W. Bush, referencing those claims that he was involved in the heroin trade during the Vietnam War. They even called him Poppy, which some believe is a nod to his alleged ties to the opium trade. And then there's the Iran-Contra scandal, where the Reagan administration was selling arms to Iran in exchange for the release of hostages and using the profits to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. It's a convoluted story, but it implicates high-level U.S. officials in both arms dealing and drug trafficking, all in the name of fighting communism.
And to bring it closer to home, Carol mentions Freeway Ricky Ross, a notorious drug kingpin, who claims the CIA supplied him with cocaine to distribute in Los Angeles during the crack epidemic in the 1980s. While these claims are difficult to prove definitively, they highlight the devastating impact of the drug trade, particularly on communities of color who were disproportionately affected by the crack epidemic. It also makes you wonder how deep these alleged connections go and how much influence intelligence agencies might have had in shaping the drug trade and its consequences.
It's a complex issue for sure. And Carroll doesn't stop there. He goes on to argue that the nature of warfare itself has changed. He says the battleground has shifted from physical conflict to something he calls information warfare.
He's talking about a new kind of conflict where the goal isn't to conquer territory, but to control the narrative. It's about shaping public perception, influencing beliefs, and ultimately winning hearts and minds. Think about it, propaganda, misinformation, even social media manipulation. It's all part of this new information war.
And it's happening all around us, right? We're
Mhm.
constantly bombarded with information from so many sources, and it can be hard to know what to believe. Carroll sees the internet as both a weapon and a shield in this information war. On the one hand, it can be used to spread misinformation and propaganda. But on the other hand, it's given a voice to people who challenge the establishment, who expose corruption and share alternative viewpoints.
And that brings us to a very recent example, the Hunter Biden laptop controversy.
Right. This is all over the news during the 2020 election. Carroll highlights the efforts to suppress the contents of the laptop, which supposedly contained compromising information about Joe Biden and his son. He points to the involvement of former intelligence officials in discrediting the story as Russian disinformation, suggesting that this was a coordinated attempt to manipulate the election. He also expresses concerns about election integrity more broadly, bringing up issues like voter ID laws and the possibility of non-citizens voting.
The Hunter Biden laptop situation is a perfect example of how information warfare can play out in the real world. It raises questions about censorship, media bias, and the role of big tech in controlling the flow of information. It also shows how difficult it can be to separate fact from fiction in a world where everyone has an agenda. What do you think, listener? How do you stay informed in this age of information overload and misinformation?
And then, of course, there's COVID-19, which might be the biggest example of information warfare in recent history. Carroll doesn't shy away from expressing his skepticism about the mainstream narrative surrounding the pandemic. He even talks about his own experience with censorship, claiming he was targeted for promoting alternative viewpoints and treatments like ivermectin, despite the lack of scientific consensus on its effectiveness.
He brings up the documentary Plandemic, which went viral in the early days of the pandemic. It promoted various conspiracy theories about the virus's origins and the motives of public health officials. He also mentions Dr. Judy Mikovits, a controversial figure who has been accused of spreading misinformation about vaccines.
Carroll's perspective here reflects a larger distrust of authority and institutions that emerged during the pandemic. People were afraid, confused, and looking for answers. It's understandable that some turned to alternative sources of information, even if those sources weren't always reliable.
And he also brings up Bill Gates, specifically his involvement in funding vaccine development and distribution. This raises questions about the role of private philanthropy in public health and whether financial incentives might influence policy decisions. It's important to be aware of potential conflicts of interest, especially when it comes to something as critical as public health.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about informed consent. People should have access to all the information they need to make decisions about their own health and well-being. But finding that information and figuring out what's true and what's not can be a real challenge. What do you think, listener Any? How did you navigate the information overload during the pandemic? What sources did you trust? And how did you make sense of all the conflicting narratives?
It's clear that Carroll is deeply skeptical of official narratives and institutions. And while we don't have to agree with all of his conclusions, he raises some important questions that are worth considering. He encourages us to think critically, to question everything, and to do our own research.
And that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground already from JFK to COVID, but the rabbit hole goes even deeper. We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive with you. Until then, listeners, stay curious.
Picking up where we left off, I think it's really interesting how Carroll ties together all these seemingly unrelated events throughout history to illustrate this pattern of powerful forces working behind the scenes.
It's like he's saying there's this hidden hand guiding events, pushing us in certain directions. And one of the examples he uses to illustrate this idea is the bombing of the USS Normandy in 1942.
Right. And what's fascinating is that this happened before the CIA even officially existed. Carroll argues that this incident demonstrates a long-standing connection between intelligence agencies and organized crime, even in the early days. Remember Operation Underworld that we talked about earlier, where the U.S. government partnered with the mob to protect the ports during World War II? Well, Carroll sees the Normandy incident as just another example of this type of collaboration.
So even before the CIA was formally established, there was already this shadowy network operating behind the scenes, willing to work with anyone, even criminals, to achieve its goals. It's a bit unsettling, isn't it, to think that these kinds of alliances have been going on for so long?
And Carroll suggests that this network extends far beyond national borders. He dives into the CIA's involvement in international affairs, claiming they played a role in overthrowing governments that threatened American corporate interests. He specifically mentions the 1954 coup in Guatemala, where the CIA helped topple the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz to protect the United Fruit Company's banana monopoly. It's a stark example of how powerful corporations can influence government actions, even to the point of interfering in the affairs of other countries.
It's like a real-life chess game, right? Yeah. With these powerful players making moves on a global scale, often with little regard for the people caught in the crossfire. And Carroll doesn't see these interventions as isolated incidents. He argues that they're part of a broader pattern of corporate influence on government policy, both domestically and internationally. It makes you wonder who's really in control. Is it the people we elect, or is it these powerful corporations and special interests pulling the strings behind the scenes?
It's a question worth pondering for sure. And Carroll connects this back to the CIA's alleged involvement in drug trafficking. He believes the agency needs off-the-books funding for these covert operations, which are often unauthorized by Congress. Remember how we talked about the opium trade in Afghanistan? Well, Carroll sees this as just one example of the CIA using the drug trade to finance its secret activities.
He also brings up George H.W. Bush, again referencing those allegations about his involvement in the heroin trade during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And then there's the Iran-Contra affair, which implicated high-ranking officials in the Reagan administration in drug trafficking and arms dealing. It's a tangled web, isn't it? And it's hard to ignore the devastating consequences of the drug trade, especially the crack cocaine epidemic that hit American cities in the 80s.
Carroll even connects that epidemic to the CIA, citing claims by individuals like Freeway Ricky Ross, who say they were supplied with cocaine by the agency. These allegations are controversial and difficult to prove, but they raise serious questions about the CIA's role in the drug trade and its impact on communities across the country. It's a dark chapter in American history, and it's one that we're still grappling with today.
It's a lot to unpack, and it paints a pretty bleak picture of how power operates in the world. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Carroll's ideas on information warfare. He makes a pretty compelling argument about how the nature of conflict has changed in the 21st century.
He's saying that battles are no longer fought solely on physical battlefields. Instead, the new battleground is the realm of information. It's about controlling the narrative, shaping public perception, and influencing hearts and minds. It's a subtler form of warfare, but it's just as impactful, if not more so.
And think about how the internet has become the primary weapon in this information war. On one hand, it's this powerful tool for spreading awareness, connecting people, and challenging the status quo. But it's also a tool for spreading misinformation, propaganda, and fake news. It's a double-edged sword, and it can be hard to know what to believe.
Carroll sees the rise of decentralized media as a potential counterforce to the traditional gatekeepers of information. He believes these alternative news sources and citizen journalists can play a crucial role in exposing corruption, holding those in power accountable, and providing a diversity of viewpoints. He argues that it's essential to have a free and open press that challenges the mainstream narrative and provides a platform for dissent. Without that, we risk becoming trapped in an echo chamber of our own beliefs.
But it's also important to be discerning, right? Just because someone is challenging the mainstream narrative doesn't mean they're automatically telling the truth. We still need to be critical thinkers to evaluate evidence and to consider multiple perspectives before forming our own conclusions. It's a constant balancing act, and it's not always easy.
Absolutely. And Carroll highlights the dangers of censorship and the suppression of dissenting voices. He believes these tactics are often used to silence those who expose uncomfortable truths or challenge those in power. It's something we need to be vigilant about, especially in this age of social media where information can be controlled and manipulated so easily.
And speaking of manipulation, Carroll brings up the Hunter Biden laptop controversy again. He's critical of the way the story was handled by both the media and social media platforms, suggesting that there was this coordinated effort to suppress the information and discredit it as Russian disinformation. It's an example of how quickly information can become weaponized in today's world, especially during a heated election cycle.
It also highlights the power of big tech companies like Twitter and Facebook to control the flow of information. Their decisions about what content to allow or remove can have a huge impact on public discourse and even on the outcome of elections. It's something we need to be aware of and to demand more transparency and accountability from these companies.
And then there's the whole COVID-19 situation, which might be the most controversial example of information warfare in recent memory. Carroll is very critical of the mainstream narrative surrounding the pandemic, questioning the origins of the virus, the effectiveness of lockdowns and mask mandates, and the safety of vaccines. He even talks about his own experience with censorship for promoting alternative viewpoints and treatments.
He mentions the documentary Plandemic again, which was widely criticized for spreading misinformation. And he talks about Dr. Judy Mikovits, a controversial figure who has been accused of promoting conspiracy theories about vaccines. He also criticizes Bill Gates for his involvement in vaccine development and distribution, suggesting that financial incentives may be influencing public health policy.
It's important to note that these are highly contentious issues, and Carroll's views are certainly not universally accepted. But his perspective reflects a broader trend of distrust in institutions and experts that have been growing in recent years.
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. But I think it's important to be open to different perspectives, to question the information we're being given, and to make our own informed decisions based on the best available evidence.
Absolutely. Blind trust in any one source, whether it's the government, the media, or even so-called experts, can be dangerous. We need to be critical thinkers to evaluate evidence and to be willing to change our minds when presented with new information. It's a process, and it's something we need to be constantly engaged in.
Now, shifting gears again, let's talk about something a bit more, all right. Ancient Carroll seems to have this fascination with ancient mysteries and unexplained phenomena. He talks about authors like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson who challenge conventional archaeological theories and propose alternative explanations for ancient structures like the pyramids and Stonehenge.
He's particularly intrigued by this idea that ancient civilizations might have possessed advanced technological knowledge that's been lost or suppressed over time. He speculates about the possibility of ancient energy technologies, lost civilizations, even extraterrestrial contact. It's fascinating stuff, even if it's highly speculative.
He also explores the concept of cataclysmic events like the Great Flood, which is mentioned in numerous ancient texts and myths. Carroll suggests that these events might have played a role in shaping human history, and that their significance may have been downplayed or ignored by mainstream historians.
It's like he's saying that our understanding of history is incomplete, that there are still so many mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. And maybe some of the things we dismiss as myths or legends actually hold a grain of truth.
I think his fascination with these ancient mysteries stems from a desire to understand our place in the universe, to explore the unknown, and to challenge the boundaries of what we think we know.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, that the search for knowledge is never ending, and that we should always be open to new possibilities.
And that's a great segue into the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still more to explore. Are you ready to continue down this rabbit hole with us, listener?
Okay, listener, we're back and ready to wrap up this wild ride through the world of conspiracies and cover-ups. Expert speaker, where do we go from here? What else does Carol get into?
Well, he goes on to discuss a topic that's always guaranteed to spark debate: Israel's influence on American politics. He suggests that this influence stems from a combination of factors, lobbying efforts, campaign contributions, and a shared strategic alliance between the two nations.
So he's basically saying that Israel has a lot of sway in Washington and that American politicians are often hesitant to criticize Israeli policies, even when those policies might be controversial.
Exactly. He uses the example of the Sabra and Shatila massacre back in 1982, where Israeli-allied Lebanese Christian militias killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians in refugee camps. This event caused international outrage and, according to Carroll, led to a shift in Israeli strategy. He argues that they began to focus more on controlling the narrative and shaping public perception through these sophisticated propaganda efforts.
It's like he's saying they realized the importance of winning hearts and minds, of controlling how people perceive the conflict.
Right. He even mentions a report called the Israel-American Language Dictionary, which outlines specific language and framing techniques designed to influence American public opinion in favor of Israel. He presents this report as evidence of a deliberate effort to control the discourse surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to demonize those who criticize Israeli policies.
Wow, that's a pretty strong claim.
Oh,
It makes you wonder about the power of language and how it can be used to shape our understanding of complex issues.
it certainly does. And this leads into the sensitive topic of anti-Semitism, which Carroll acknowledges is a real problem, but argues is often used to silence legitimate criticism of Israel. He suggests that conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism has created this climate of fear where people are afraid to speak out against Israeli policies for fear of being labeled anti-Semitic.
It's a tricky issue for sure. It's important to condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, but it's also important to allow for open and honest debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
How do we strike that balance? How do we ensure that criticism of Israel's government or policies isn't misconstrued as hatred towards Jewish people as a whole?
It's a question that societies around the world are grappling with, and there's no easy answer. It requires nuanced understanding and a willingness to engage in these difficult conversations. Carroll then delves into the history of Israel's founding, suggesting that it's intertwined with organized crime figures and militant groups. He argues that these connections have had a lasting impact on Israeli politics and its relationship with the United States.
It's like he's drawing a parallel between Israel's origins and some of the other shadowy networks we've been discussing, like the CIA's alleged ties to organized crime.
Exactly. He talks about groups like the Irgun and the Lehi, which were considered terrorist organizations by the British government before Israel's independence. He argues that the legacy of these groups, which used violence and intimidation to achieve their goals, continues to influence Israeli policies and its approach to security.
So he's saying that the ends justify the means. That even if a group uses questionable tactics, their actions can be justified if they ultimately lead to a desirable outcome.
That seems to be his argument, though. It's certainly a controversial one. He also points to the influence of wealthy Jewish philanthropists and financiers like the Rothschild family, who played a role in supporting Israel's creation and continue to wield considerable influence within the nation.
It's a complex history for sure. And it raises all sorts of questions about the nature of power, the role of ideology, and the challenges of achieving peace in a region marked by so much conflict and mistrust. What do you think, listener? How does this information about Israel's history change your understanding of the current situation in the Middle East?
Now let's shift gears one last time and talk about something that might seem completely unrelated: ancient mysteries. Carroll seems to have a real fascination with the unexplained and the possibility that our understanding of history might be incomplete or even inaccurate.
Yeah, he talks about authors like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson who challenge conventional archaeological theories and propose alternative explanations for ancient structures like the pyramids and Stonehenge. It's fascinating stuff, even if it's highly speculative.
He seems particularly intrigued by the idea that ancient civilizations might have possessed advanced technological knowledge that's been lost or suppressed over time. He speculates about the possibility of ancient energy technologies, lost civilizations, even extraterrestrial contact.
It's like he's saying that we might be underestimating the capabilities of our ancestors, that maybe they were more advanced than we give them credit for.
Exactly. He also explores the concept of cataclysmic events like the Great Flood, which is mentioned in numerous ancient texts and myths. He suggests that these events might have played a role in shaping human history and that their significance may have been downplayed or ignored by mainstream historians.
So he's not just questioning our understanding of technology and civilization, but also the timeline of history itself. Well, it's a pretty radical idea, isn't it?
It certainly is. But I think his fascination with these ancient mysteries stems from a desire to understand our place in the universe, to explore the unknown, and to challenge the boundaries of what we think we know.
And that's a great takeaway from this entire deep dive. Carroll's exploration of conspiracies and cover-ups has taken us on this wild ride through history, politics, and even ancient mysteries. He's challenged us to think critically, to question everything, and to be open to new possibilities.
He's shown us that there's often more to the story than we're initially told, and that the search for truth can be a long and winding road.
So listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are your thoughts? What resonates with you the most? What questions are you left with? And most importantly, what rabbit holes are you going to explore next?
Remember, keep an open mind, but always be discerning. Question everything, do your own research, and never stop seeking knowledge.
That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep